In this video, I'm going to continue to take a look here at some of the activities and approaches that are oftentimes utilized when exegeting biblical text. So in our class, we have already discussed several of these points, what we call the third-party perspective, the differences in language between most English readers of the biblical text and these biblical texts being written in a different language, the cultural gap that exists between the cultures of readers today and the culture of the authors of the biblical text. We also talked about the historical gap and that there is just a difference in time that is taking place, and over time, the way in which there are things that take place through that time that affects meaning. The nature of the historical documents, the fact that these documents that we have are usually composed by multiple authors. They usually go through a process of editing. They are oftentimes redacted. Sometimes these texts are not attempting to be original. For instance, the basic theory is that Matthew and Luke use Mark's gospel, and when they're using Mark, that it's not being original, they're using a earlier work, and so even Mark's gospel may be using earlier material. We don't know. This is, of course, a more kind of questionable decisions, but that's part of the nature of a lot of historical documents. Is they don't have to be always original. Pseudonymity is another big problem because it was a common practice for people to write in the name of others with different kinds of purposes or motivations for doing so, not always nefarious to try and trick people, but sometimes it was done to honor individuals, to maintain an individual's influence. And so that's an issue that sometimes has to be dealt with when exegeting a text. And so also there are multiple and differing texts of the same documents. And so that becomes an interesting question when we look at the manuscript evidence and why texts are sometimes, what we have in these manuscripts are different from one another. And sometimes just the very nature of sacred texts themselves. As texts that belong to a group of people who hold these things as somehow or another divine in some way or connected to God in some way, and therefore there may be different views as to how a text is to be treated. And so the nature of them being sacred texts may have affected the way in which they are not only composed, but also then preserved. So there are several criticisms that are helpful for us when we exegete Scripture. There are four that I believe are absolutely crucial, that every person who wants to identify what an original author or authors was trying to communicate to their audience. So certainly one of the first things that has to be done is you have to establish the text that you are working with. And by establishing the text, this is where we get into textual criticisms. Textual criticism is about exploring what the original text may have been, because over time, these texts, the biblical texts, got edited by scribes. And so sometimes these scribes make mistakes, or sometimes they do things to a text that they think are in line with the needs of the church. So sometimes you might have an addition of words, or sometimes you might have the omission of words, or sometimes you may have a harmonization of a text with another text with a similar idea. So because we have so many manuscripts of the biblical text, we compare these manuscripts to see what may have been a part of that original text. And we have manuscripts that are written in a number of different languages. And so the question sometimes be, could something in a in say, for instance, with the New Testament in a different language than Greek, might it reflect something about what was in the original text as opposed to the Greek manuscripts. So textual criticism is a very important activity in exegesis and is one that we will spend next week looking at. So grammatical criticism as well. These are answering questions about the language and the syntax of the text. I think most people are pretty familiar that you got to understand the words that are there and the ways in which words were used at the time that the author used them, and syntax, the way in which where words are placed and how they are placed in certain areas, the kind of emphasis that might be being made by the author in the word placement. Certainly, historical criticism is determining the original historical, geographical, and cultural setting of the text. It's very huge. So, how are you going to understand, when ideas and concepts and institutions and groups are mentioned if you don't have that kind of historical background? Places are mentioned. Where are these places? And what events took place in these regions, and who is in charge, who's in power, and the economy. So historical criticism is a extremely important part. You can't exegete a text without engaging in that discipline. And then literary criticism, and this is answering the questions about the genre. So again, absolutely crucial. Genre, the genre of a text, and what kind of text it is, in a sense, dictates how the text is supposed to be read. And here's where a lot of interpretation of Scripture can really go awry when the interpreter is not recognizing the kind of genre of the material that they're reading. So, if you're dealing with poetry, you've got to engage with material as poetry and realize that poets have followed certain practices that when people are writing law, they don't have to practice. So recognizing whether it's, a parable or some kind of narrative, or whether or not it is wisdom material, whether or not it is legal materials, if it is trying to work as a biography or historiography. So, understanding its genre is absolutely crucial for the exegetical work. Also, its composition, where material is placed inside the particular book. So you look at material and interpret material, or you learn to exegete that material, finding out what the author is trying to say because of where that they have organized or arranged their material. And so the rhetorical features of the text. So texts are intended to persuade. So each author of the biblical text want to persuade their audience to believe certain things, to do certain things. And so how do they go about persuading them to do that thing or believe that thing? So there are different rhetorical strategies that existed. There were rhetorical handbooks that existed in the ancient world. And so these handbooks, are telling people how to communicate in oral fashion sometimes, but some of these same kind of rhetorical skills are used in writing for persuasion purposes. And so the literary criticism is going to kind of take in effect this kind of rhetorical analysis. Now, there are 5 what I could call kind of questionable agendas that are sometimes used in exegesis. So by saying questionable agendas, I'm not saying that these are not disciplines that are worthy to investigate, that they're not worthy to explore, and sometimes even worthy to utilize. But we do, when engaging them, we do need to be aware that they do bring an agenda, and all people bring an agenda probably to their exegesis, as Bultmann has said. There's no such thing as a presuppositionalist exegesis. We exegete with things in our mind, with goals in our minds. And so sometimes when we exegete, we're trying to look for informations that conform or help us reach our goals. But here are some agendas that just need to be thought about when a person is seeking to determine what an author is trying to communicate to their audience. So there's canonical, determining how biblical text shaped believing communities. So, for instance, people writing these New Testament texts, I mean, they already, in a sense, have authoritative text for their faith. So we refer to it as the Old Testament. They might refer to it as the law and the prophets. And so, and so there, how does what they are writing, how is that understood in light of the other of these documents? Now, canonical criticism also can approach the exegesis activity by recognizing that we can exegete a book based upon where it is in the actual canon, the Christian canon. And so for doing that, that's a position that you're taking by accepting, as it were, that the placement of these books in the order in which we have them within our New Testament or in the Bible should somehow or another affect. Now, not everyone will accept this. Not everyone believes that you have to, or it is important for the exegetical process to understand where a text is in the canon. So that's why it's questionable. There may be, it certainly seems to be right and appropriate to think about biblical text and exegeting them in light of all that we know of truths or ideas in the rest of the canon. And so maybe how we exegete a text or what we claim an author is saying might be formed or should be formed by what other authors are saying, so that this author is seen in light of that. But we have to be very careful, because we don't want to take a position of saying, well, this author can't be saying something that disagrees or is contradictory to what another author says, because then that puts the exegesis into a straitjacket. The exegesis needs to find out what the author, or as best as they can, what the author most likely is trying to convey. And if it turns out that it stands in tension or contradiction to something else, well then, as far as I'm concerned, so be it. We will then, in our interpretation of that text, not the exegesis, but in the interpretation of that text, we'll wrestle with those questions. So canonical criticism is, a somewhat more kind of fairly new approach in the last several decades, new. And so it brings its own agendas to dealing with these texts. It's worthwhile investigating and exploring and seeing how canonical critics might exegete a text, but realizing as well the agendas that they have. So form criticisms has been around for about 100 years or more, and this is understanding the literary units used in a text. This too is questionable, because sometimes it makes judgments about material. This oftentimes, I'm thinking about in the Gospels, where things are designated as a certain form. Of course, and a good example would be parables. Most people kind of understand what a parable is. And when they see a parable, how do you know what a parable is? Well, because there are these other parables that exist, and how does this parable kind of fit or follow the form of other parables? So form critics are just trying to identify what the form is, because kind of like with genre, once you know what the form is, it may be clues about how to exegete it. Of course, one of the agenda issues that has to be realized is that sometimes things are classified in a particular form because there are already presuppositions about the existence of these forms, which may or may not be valid. And so if something is called, say, a conflict story, well, is that really a form that existed? And so when we have stories about Jesus and the Pharisees and having a conflict, was there really a conflict story form so that we can now label this particular episode a conflict narrative? So sometimes there are desires to be able to categorize materials into specific forms, but again, it may not be that these types of forms were understood at the time that these authors were writing them. Now, some authors may have written things that they knew, okay, I'm writing this as law, and so, it's put down as law. And others who say, I'm providing a wisdom saying, I'm providing a proverb, and so it's written in the form of a proverb. Okay, so, fair enough. The author may have intended for that particular materials to come across like that. But other times they may not be guided by an awareness of a particular form. And we may once again be trying to pigeonhole materials into predetermined forms that really don't exist. Tradition. So this is determining the earlier stages of the year. Now this is very hypothetical because what this this kind of tradition criticism developed after form criticism. So the form critic says, okay, this is the form, and then what they imagined is, okay, say for instance in the Gospels, if you have a miracle story, how did that miracle story develop through the life of the church before it was ever kind of written down? And so, of course, not to assume that just because it was written down that the development of the story didn't continue on. Just getting to the written point is not always the end goal. But in the kind of oral tradition of the church, these stories would have existed, or it's assumed these stories would have existed for some time. And then how did they function in these communities before it ever was written in a gospel format? Redaction criticism. So this is answering questions about how the text has been edited by an author and redacted into its final form. So, this is, again, very helpful, particularly with the Gospels. So if we go by the theory that Matthew and Luke had Mark's Gospel, we can see that there are materials in Mark that also show up in Matthew and Luke, but they'll show up in a little bit different. There will be words that will be used, and sometimes these words reflect the author's, particular outlook and the way in which the author wants to present Jesus, or what the author thinks is important or relevant. And so redaction criticism has been very helpful with regards to Gospels, and then talking about how Matthew may have edited a story. The author of Matthew's Gospel may have edited Mark, or how Luke may have done so. But also we can talk about even in Paul's writings that Paul may borrow from other sources and how he may have edited those sources. So particularly we might think about creeds. There may have been early Christian creeds, which Paul is aware of, and Paul utilizes it, but he redacts it. He edits that creed in some way for making the point he wants to make in his letter. So redaction criticism is helpful, but again, it's based off of some theories, that certain things existed that the author had access to, and some may question whether or not that indeed is the case. And the last one that I'll mention here is structural criticism. So structural criticism is answering questions about a text's subject matter and its theology by turning what it's called its deep structure. So in other words, sometimes the way in which a piece of literature works, that there are things that are being conveyed in the organization of that material that are not self-conscious by the author, but nevertheless exist there inside the structure of the text itself. And so structural analysis tries to get at things that may be assumed about a topic, or maybe assumed about in the world in which the author lived in, and that as the author is writing down their materials, there are certain things that are coming through the text that may not be a part of this author's intention, but nevertheless are present to be recognized within the text itself. So, structural analysis is really coming again from the discipline of literature, and what they have been doing by looking at the structures of novels and structures of other materials. And so biblical critics have picked up what these literary critics have been doing with structural analysis, and then tried to apply them to a biblical text. So anyway, those are some of the criticisms, some that are very helpful for exegesis, some that are kind of more questionable, but nevertheless should be explored when the person wants to determine what an author was trying to communicate